Okay, so we'll make a start. We're delighted to welcome you all to this evening's lecture with Dr. Esther Asprey, Shropshire Dialect Studies, looking back to look forwards. Excuse me. We're thrilled to welcome Esther for her first lecture with us, and the lecture is part of a programme of 11 humanities lectures that we're currently hosting. My name is Paula Harrison, and I'm the coordinator of University Centre Telford. We're part of the University of Wolverhampton, and we're based in the heart of Telford in Shropshire. We moved our public lecture programme online at the start of the pandemic, and it has been hugely successful, attracting people locally, nationally and globally. So before I hand over to Esther, just a couple of housekeeping things to go through. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the lecture via the Q&A button. And if you're using a laptop or a desktop, the icon is on the bottom of your screen in the middle. And if you're using a mobile, it will be in the top right-hand corner. And just to remind you that Zoom is a public platform and the lecture is being recorded, so please don't share any personal information. Dr. Esther Asprey is a senior lecturer in English language and linguistics at the University of Wolverhampton. She is a sociolinguist and dialectologist whose specialist area of research is linguistic variation in the West Midlands. She gained her first degree in English language and German at the University of Edinburgh before going on to complete a master's. She then gained her PhD from the University of Leeds in 2007, writing on Black Country English and Black Country identity. Esther went on to teach at the University of Birmingham and then at Aston University, where she was research assistant for 3 years on a series of funded projects looking at performances of identity using Birmingham and Black Country dialects. So a very warm welcome to you, Esther. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for hosting this talk. I'm really looking forward to giving this talk, and I hope that you will all enjoy it too. And I've called it Looking Back to Look Forwards, because I have worked primarily on, as Paula said in the introduction, Black Country and Birmingham dialects, but recently I've begun to look at the neighbours, really. I've started to look at the dialects of neighbouring counties, and we will see that there are a lot of commonalities between Shropshire and Staffordshire and Worcestershire and Herefordshire. And what I want to talk about tonight is the fact that Shropshire really is, for academic purposes, under-researched. So there's been quite a lot of work done over the centuries. I'm sure many of you in the audience are aware and have worked with some of these sources, and I'm going to touch on what those sources are. But from my point of view as an academic, there's woefully little that we can sort of go to a library and access. There are some wonderful, wonderful gems, but they've mostly been produced without the help of academia. So people who were ineligible to take degrees, women particularly in the 19th century who couldn't graduate, women in the 20th century who have taken it upon themselves, and men, to record the heritage and the dialect that they hear around them, to record the oral history that they hear. And there are sources, but they're spread far and wide, and they're not always in the university setting, and they're not always accessible to the public. And I think that should change. So I'm going to take you back into the past to look at the kind of rich sources that we have and what they tell us about Shropshire dialect. What is it? Is it a West Midlands dialect, for example? Where does Wales come into it? Where do neighbouring counties come into it? You know, where does Shropshire dialect stop? Do we get to the county boundary and people suddenly start talking differently? Is that changing across time? So I want to look backwards in order to say what we have to do to go forwards, I think. And that's what I'm going to do tonight. And hopefully in a timely fashion. So please do put any questions at any time into the box, and then we will field those. I'll leave plenty of time for questions. So here's an OS map of Shropshire. And we can see that I've really worked in the neighbouring Black Country. And I haven't done any field work in Shropshire, and I'm certainly not going to give that impression tonight that any field work has been done by me on Shropshire. I'm not an expert. I've come to talk to you from the point of view of a linguist who does this kind of work and has done it in other areas that are linguistically very similar, but also linguistically notably different in some ways. So just an overview of the county then. And you can see that Telford and Wrekin here is represented geographically, so it's not cut off from the rest of Shropshire as a different council area. I've used a geographical map. You can see the Welsh border as well. Okay. So the first person I want to talk about who worked on Shropshire dialect was a musicologist. So he studied the science of music, and he was also a philologist, so a great linguist, spoke many languages, and was to some extent a self-trained linguist who made one of the first attempts to write down speech phonetically. So he invented his own phonetic alphabet. At the time that he was working, there wasn't a standardized international phonetic alphabet, although people were talking about this. And he also thought that he could invent a better one. So he invented a rather complicated alphabet, some symbols of which are now in the International Phonetic Alphabet. He went to Eton and later to Shrewsbury School. I'm not going to be drawn on Shrewsbury and Shrewsbury pronunciations, by the way. I probably will say Shrewsbury just because the people that I know there, they call it Shrewsbury. And of course, that's an interesting variable in itself because there are two pronunciations. One of them is before vowels shifted through what we call the Great Vowel Shift. So you get things like my twos, pick up the soup, shrews. And you can see that the creature is still called a shrew. It's not called a shrow. But many words, actually, the speakers altered the pronunciation of those words historically, so that we don't say twos in standard English in received pronunciation anymore. We say toes. The things on the end of your feet are toes. We don't wear coats. We don't wear coots anymore in standard English. We wear coats. But in Black Country dialect, for example, the dialect I researched, people certainly do have painful twos and wear coots. So it's absolutely normal that there would be two pronunciations of shrews, Shrewsbury. And Alexander Ellis, as a philologist, proposed and actually carried out the first large-scale dialect survey of the British Isles. So we're talking geographically the British Isles. He covered the Republic of Ireland as well, the Isle of Man. And he trained two field workers to write the alphabet that he had invented. And they went out together. They had many ways of getting data. And I'll talk a little bit about those. First of all, he invented a passage. So I put it up for you here. He called it the Dialect Test. And then that was given to all of his field workers, and he sent them out on the road with it. So they would go out on their bicycles and cycle around rural areas, and they would find likely suspects to talk to. So they would go to, for example, factories and wait for the factory hooter to go. And then they would collar somebody and say, would you mind telling us how you would read this passage out? You know, how would people say it around here? Or they would just engage them in conversation and take notes. The other prong of his fork, if you like, is that he sent this to people within places that he knew already, and he asked them to disseminate this passage. So could you give it to a school teacher and ask them to try and write it down for me as they think rural people say it? Remembering that literacy was not nearly as widespread as it is now, he couldn't guarantee that everybody in a village would be literate. And very often these school mistresses and schoolmasters would go and find people that they believed to be good examples of traditional dialect speakers. And they would ask them, you know, how would you say this passage? They'd say it to them, and the person would say it back as they might say it. And we can talk a lot about how accurate this kind of data might be. Think about that. Just think yourself back to sort of 1871. So you're a rural labourer, you know, maybe, I don't know what you're doing, you're hot picking, and somebody comes up to you in Herefordshire and says, I'm going to read out this passage. So I say, mates, you see now that I am right about that little girl coming from the school yonder. We can see that there are problems already. You're not likely to change the words. You're not likely to say a different word instead of mate. But in fact, they did. In Shropshire, some of the people that he asked, they replaced mate with jockey. They would replace mate with pal in parts of Scotland. They did replace certain words. And that gives us a bit of an indication that they might have felt a bit like they weren't tied to the written word. They could tell Alexander Ellis and his field workers exactly how they would say the passage. And that's interesting, because I think doing this kind of thing now might produce different results. And he ends up with a huge wealth of data, which he writes down in his alphabet. And he produces volume after volume after volume of books based on this, which I'll reference at the end. And it's the last two volumes, volume 5 and volume 4, that concern us the most, because in volume 4, he tells us all about his alphabet. In volume 5, he publishes his results, and he starts to draw together areas that he thinks share dialect features. So what can we say? Well, we can see where Shropshire is hidden here. And actually it falls across at least two major areas. So there's a little bit of Shropshire in what he calls the Northern Midlands division. But for Ellis's purposes, Shropshire tends to fall into what he calls the upper southwest, which would suggest that it is, and we need to think about this, that it has links to the southwest. And most of us now will think of the southwest in regional terms as perhaps being Cornwall, Devon. I don't know where that would stop for all of you. Cornwall, Devon, how high do we go? How high out of the southwest can we go? Somerset, Dorset, Gloucestershire, Wiltshire, Worcestershire, Herefordshire. Shropshire is very similar, Ellis says, drawing on, and he draws on 13 different features of the dialect, some pronunciation, some to do with the shape of words, so how you put the plural on a noun, for example, some to do with verbs, so if it's a progressive, like I was walking down the street, do people in that area say I was walking down the street? And he said yes, they do in Shropshire. That's one particular thing that they do. How do they talk about what she did? Do they say she did it or did it? Well, in Shropshire, nearly everybody says did it. And you can still hear that now, I think, but it's becoming much rarer. He collated many variables, some of which were to do with pronouncing things and some of which were to do with the shape of words. And he comes up with these different areas. And that is the interesting finding, really, that the north of Shropshire seems to be markedly different in dialect terms. Ellis thinks that it's rather different. And surprisingly, most of the rest of the county is allied to the west. And of course, you've got a big boundary with Wales, because at the time that Ellis was working, the Wales that borders Shropshire was by and large still Welsh speaking. And so the English that they were acquiring, to think about what kind of English Welsh speaking children were learning on both sides of the border, it's likely that many of them were only acquiring English when they went to school. And that would be a kind of standardized English with some sort of standardized accent, even if it isn't whatever we want to call it, received pronunciation, Queen's English. It probably had a regional flavour, but they might not have been acquiring Shropshire dialect variables. So that's quite interesting to think about. And people have talked about Alexander Ellis. Some people have criticised him because of the alphabet that he invented and said, actually with 3 field workers, that the possibility for you hearing things wrong is quite immense. You weren't recording the speakers that you talked to. You're just listening with your ears and then writing down what you think they said. What if you're just not very good at hearing? What if you don't hear accurately? And there was a lot of competition, I suppose, to prove that Alexander Ellis was inaccurate. So Joseph Wright, for example, who went on to write the English Dialect Dictionary, sniped at him and said that Ellis was inaccurate. Ellis recorded things inaccurately. He heard things incorrectly. His field workers weren't very well trained. But there have been defenders of Ellis's work, and I think I would defend Ellis's work. He took on a huge area, a huge task, and he worked on it for years and years and years off his own bat with no help, really, no funding. And it is detailed. So he did manage to access a great number of dialect speakers. The other good thing is that he didn't avoid urban areas. So for various reasons, Ellis felt that it was really important to record dialect as it was spoken rather than dialect as Alexander Ellis would like to hear it spoken. And he did go to urban locations. So he does go to Ironbridge, for example, places where there are migrants coming in. And it had been argued that, in fact, migration affects dialect purity. And we can talk about that a little bit later. Does migration change the way people speak? Do incomers to a region change the local dialect? Sorry. Alexander Ellis didn't shy away from any of that, but he wanted to write it all down, and he's left us a very detailed record. And David Britton summed it up in 2012. He says, what does Ellis's map show? An extensive southwestern and southern area, coming from Cornwall up to Kent and the outskirts of London, reaching almost to the Midlands. So there is this southwestern / southern area. We're concerned with the southwestern area, obviously on our side of the country. It also shows an East Anglian and an East Midlands area, an area along the Welsh border comprising Monmouth, Herefordshire and Shropshire. So there really is, we'll go back and look in a minute. A lower north incorporating the Midlands, Lancashire and the main industrial cities of the north, an upper north of rural North Yorkshire and Cumbria, and a distinctive northeast. So Ellis was mapping different dialect areas that had things in common that we could say, this is the southwestern area, this is the East Midlands area. And the interesting thing for us is that while there is a southwestern flavour to most of Shropshire, there is this sort of commonality between Herefordshire and Shropshire and Monmouthshire, which is a complex entity anyway, because it was largely controlled by English administration for a long time before it was properly assigned back to Wales. So there's a lot of complicated stuff going on. And David Britton is quite right that Ellis picks this out where other people have obscured it, other people have ignored Shropshire. The second source that I'm going to lead you through is from the 1950s. So we have one from the 1880s, the 1870s to 1880s is when that data was being collected. The next survey is quite different in character, and I'm sure many of you have heard of it. And I will show you this article later on, perhaps. So this is a little bit about the survey. I'll leave it there for those of you who want to access the slides and the talk. It's the Survey of English Dialects, and that was carried out by Professor Harold Orton at the University of Leeds, and 9 trained field workers. Now, when I say trained, they were mostly master's students under his tuition. Some of them were doctoral students, but they were trained by Harold Orton to write down the International Phonetic Alphabet. The good thing for us is that they only sent 1 field worker to the whole of Shropshire. When you get multiple field workers, that's kind of a blessing because sometimes you get more accurate data. 1 field worker will be better at listening, but what you do get is differences, and then you really aren't sure that, you know, one person will hear bath and they'll write down bath with a short vowel. One person will hear bath and think, well, that's a long vowel, I'll write ah. If you've got 1 field worker, you get the differences reduced. So Donald Sykes did the whole of Shropshire, and he did this between 1950 and 1961. They had a very different approach to Alexander Ellis. So they didn't speak to women. Alexander Ellis had spoken to women. And I want you to think about that. Do women speak dialect as much as men? Do women speak dialect that is just as pure as the dialect that men speak? The belief by about 1950 was that they didn't, that women were more socially aspirational. Women of all classes would attempt to speak posher, shall we say, and they were therefore not reliable informants, and they should be avoided. The other thing that they were obsessed with was rural dialectology, because they perceived rural dialectology to preserve pure dialect. And I want you to think about that as well, really. To what extent could we say that that's ever been true? Is still true now? They certainly ignored the fact that most of the people they spoke to had seen active service either in the First or the Second World War, or in some cases both, and had in fact done a lot of socializing with people from a lot of different areas of Britain, and were possibly much more aware of dialect difference than the field workers hypothesized. They spoke to the oldest people they could find at each location. So again, this idea that the pure dialect is older. As dialect goes on in time, it becomes corrupt and it becomes influenced by other regions, influenced by other speakers from other regions. And so they looked for people who had been non-mobile, although they couldn't get around the fact that these people had seen active service. And so many of these people weren't as non-mobile as they kind of hoped that they would be. They had, for example, commuted to the nearest big town to sell fruit and veg or to sell livestock on a regular basis, and they'd come into contact with speakers of, so for example, on the Shropshire border, they have people talking about Welsh speakers and going over the border into Wales to, you know, conduct sales and sell livestock and business transactions, marriages across the border. They weren't quite as non-mobile as the field workers hoped. So where do they go in Shropshire then? What can we say about where they visit? Well, I've done a nice little map, which, although it has Priest on it twice for some reason that I can't quite fathom, it does show you all the locations they went to. And I'll just have a drink for a second. So Llanymynech, of course, is straddling the border, and it's marked here as Powys, but it was counted as Shropshire for the purposes of the survey. And for some reason, Clun doesn't show up, but Clun I've put an arrow to. You can see that they've got reasonable coverage, but again, look how they skirt away from Telford and Wrekin and the more industrial area of Shropshire. So they didn't perceive it nearly rural enough. The eastern side of Shropshire was perceived as, and you can see that they completely avoided Shrewsbury, for example. They don't go to Oswestry. These places are seen as too big and too mixed to yield any pure dialect, and they are avoided, deliberately avoided. And we might want to think about that. How sensible would that be with a modern day dialect survey if we were going to look now? When they go to these locations, I'm going to try and show you what they find there. Well, first of all, just to show you, we can see that there is indeed, as Ellis saw, this is a map that appeared in Trudgill in 1982, and it was based on the Survey of English Dialects. And there is one key thing which kind of links to what Alexander Ellis says. If you look, you can see that stretching up almost to the top of well, the top of the Shropshire border is a big thick line here, and the blue arrow pointing says foot, but then blood, good, cut. So we've got foot but blood, good but cut. Whereas if we go further north, there isn't any split. You don't get foot, you get foot, blood, good, cut. And I kind of have half of this split, so bear with me. I will try to reproduce it for you, but I have it myself. So reproducing it not being there is hard for me. What the map suggests, in fact, is that this foot strut split has taken place in some of Shropshire, particularly along the Welsh border, that people will say things like cut, I cut myself, blood, blood everywhere, but they will say foot and good, as we all do. So there's some suggestion that this runs right through the county of Shropshire. And if we actually go out to the east of Shropshire, it hasn't happened at the time that the Survey of English Dialects was taking place, that some speakers, they only say foot, blood, good, cut in Shropshire. So you can tell me whether you do, what's going on. And I'm going to problematize this map actually, because this is what we always show beginners, but it's much harder than this. If you look at the red box and the second line, it says hat, dance, crash, fast. And I think that's a pretty good giveaway of a northerner. But if you look at the blue box, we get hat, dance, crash, fast. And I want you to think about what goes on in Shropshire, because this is not the whole picture. This is supposed to be the big take-home message from the Survey of English Dialects, as lots of linguists have presented it to us in introductory textbooks. And it's not true. It's not true at all. There may be speakers in Shropshire who say fast. There may be even increasing dance, but there is a third variant. So there's dance and fast. And I want us to think about that. And I'm going to play you some speakers and you can hear for yourself. So these lines, we call them isoglosses in linguistics. Isoglosses, basically like you would talk about isobars of pressure. They are a sort of imaginary line where one particular pronunciation ceases and another one starts. And I'm sure I don't need to patronize you. It's not the case that you walk out of, for example, I don't know, you come out of Shropshire into Cheshire and everybody's saying foot and blood and good and cut. You go back into Shropshire and they're saying cut. It really isn't that simple. And we're going to have a little look at this. So this is another map showing foot, strut. And you can see that Shropshire is meant to be a county where blood and cut pronunciations are found. And we're going to see if that's true. More accurate map here. Now, this is a more accurate map recreated from the Survey of English Dialects in a different textbook that I've taught from. This is Chambers and Trudgill, and they have revised their opinions of it. So you can see, if you look at this little area that says ah, and it's got a sort of semicolon and a r here, there's a tiny little enclave just at the top of, just at the top of Shropshire, really, and that's r, which suggests that r is still pronounced. Okay, the rest is showing you instead of bath, it's showing you bath. So it's trap, but it's bath. There's a split, but the split isn't that everybody's saying bath. That's only happened in London and East Anglia at the time of the Survey of English Dialects. So the danger with isoglosses is that you can kind of overinterpret, and you've got to squish out all the variation anyway to say anything about a big expanse of space. And they did do this, linguists did this, and it's kind of backfiring on us. So Shropshire accents are traditionally pronouncing, all of England was, and it can still be heard. So here's a speaker I'm going to play you now from Weston under Lizard. And if you listen to him, he's talking about how to harness your horses for ploughing. He says you put the two first double, and you'll hear it quite clearly.
You remember him stopping the farmers and sending the foal up, unless you had a lad. See, you lead the first. You see, a place like Wolverhampton and all them big towns, you could drive four in length, one in front of each other, nobody with you. See? Then then it come as they stopped us. We was to have three. And put the two first doubles, we got them more under control, if you can understand, because you could put a line, get a geo line, fasten it onto that arse of that side and one of this side, see?
So you can hear that he said horse, he said first double, he said he puts the one in front of t'other, and he's definitely got r. Okay. So that's a feature that needs looking at, really. How how many speakers in Shropshire still do that. That is traditionally Shropshire, that the r is pronounced in front of all the vowels that could pronounce it, and that it's being lost. That's something that should be looked at, really. Another really well-known feature of Shropshire dialects, you can see it, for example, if you read Mary Webb, when she's a very good reproducer of dialects, and she does this quite faithfully when she's got negative verbs, what we call modal verbs, helping verbs like could and should and would. Instead of would not, wouldn't, like we get in standard English, we get wouldna, couldna, dunna, conna, or canna, conna, munna, shanna. And you can still see these forms today in dialect writing, and you do still hear them. It's not confined to Shropshire, and in fact, it's not really a Western feature down just the western border. It's not found in Herefordshire in any great number, for example, but it's found in Worcestershire and Staffordshire. So if you do go over to the north and to the east, you find it there as well. And it does come from some sort of nut. So you would have had wood nut. You get that sometimes with very old speakers in Shropshire if they're being insistent. They'll say, wood nut instead of woodna or connor, connat. So it's kind of I definitely wouldn't, a connat, I really can't. And that's where it came from. The tut was dropped in the end. And it's definitely still, if you read Arnold Bennett, for example, he writes about the potteries, and all his speakers in Staffordshire do the same thing. So this is a Midlands feature, really, and it's very traditional Shropshire, and it would be very, very interesting to see how many people still do it, whether they realise that it's very Shropshire. It would be a very difficult candidate for survival in a kind of culture where dialect is not taught in schools and not appreciated, and it will be taught sometimes, and certain poems will be selected and certain novels, but spoken dialect doesn't feature in most of our classrooms. I talked a little bit about this one. So the use of her, where standard English has she, is common across Shropshire historically, and it does come directly from just Mercian Old English. So that Mercia, the land of the border with Wales, Mercia, that particular dialect has sheo. Has heyo instead of she. Heyo is just the Old English. And it's lasted. Is it still lasting? Is it still there? So these are the traditional features. And there are some really interesting features of the grammar in Shropshire. So there are, for example, gendered references to things that aren't living, which we tend to associate with the Southwest. And this is a good example of what Alexander Ellis was talking about. When he did his survey, he found more of these than they're finding in 1950. I'm going to play you an example now. You will see that the speaker in Clun, so he's in Diddlebury, he calls the hedge him. We didn't always go up there in the frost and snow pleaching at him, so we didn't always go pleaching the hedges when it was cold, but we did it when it was warm. He's talking about hedging techniques. How did you hedge? And listen out as well, for it was more than halfway up him, so the snow was very high. It was more than halfway up it, we would say. He says him, and this is also from Old English. This is just a case that we've lost. We used to have an accusative case and we've lost it, but this is associated with the Southwest dialect. So let's listen to this speaker from Clun. Now, this recording is very crackly. I will try and turn the sound up as much as I can.
Tell us how you did your hedging.
How I done hedging? Oh, I used to do it like, how do you mean by the job or work? Oh, by day work, like when I lived in the house.
But what did you used to do?
Oh, preach the edges down, like cut the tall edges down, preach them down, to make them better fences.
Mm.
Yes. I can take you to some edges. Well, if I could go, I could take you some edges now what I done over 30 years ago, and there ain't hardly a mark in them now, nothing a glat. No, that was up on the hill, up here at Collins's. Oh, there ain't been no barbed wire fence nor nothing to them, only they grow to many as well. Yeah.
What tools do you use when you...
What?
What tools?
Oh, axe and a brummock, and some sickles sometimes, and a pair of mittens. Oh, and if you were ditching, you'd have your spade along. Yeah. I preached one up on the Black Hill once, and there was an old chap there
8 years of age. And he said he'd never seen him done before. And there were sticks there, oh, I was almost as big grown as my body. And oh, we didn't all go. We was up there in frost and snow preaching at him, and it was, of course, the frost had gone right through the sticks. All the younger ones growed right enough, but some of the big old ones, like, died away. It was cold up there too.
Do you have very severe winters up here?
Oh, nothing extra, no. That one winter we had all that terrible snow, you know. There was Yodna coming in here then, that thing. It was above that wicket. Out there, above the wicket. Yes, all full up, and you couldn't see the garden edge for snow. Had to dig a road down the garden like to get in and out like to get the coal and that. Only I could get outside then, of course. I could get out at my work then. To the top garden edge, you couldn't see him for snow, covered over, drifted. And the back door where I got out, where they used to fetch the water through, which was more than halfway up him. I had to go out round the other way and carry it all out from there before I could get any water in.
But they didn't call it water in the old days, did they?
What?
Did they call it water in the old days?
Oh, waiter?
That's it.
So I actually ended up playing the whole of that, but it's a really lovely clip. And he also says fences. I don't know if you noticed, but he says this, instead of fences, he says fences, which is another very southwestern feature that you would say vox instead of fox. So that's where we get vixen from. It's not fixen. We have adopted that one southwestern word into standard English. So we have a vixen for a female fox. And you get that. You get my father and fences. And that's very southwest. So I think a lot of us would associate that maybe with Cornwall and Devon. But it happens in Shropshire, as you've just seen. And the three examples are right at the end because, of course, he's talking about the snow. And you heard him. He does use him. Okay. One of the most interesting areas, really, for linguists is the verb to be. And I'm pretty sure that all of you would agree with me that it is a fascinating verb, trust me, because it's so frequent, it's subject to a great deal of change in dialects because we use the verb to be so much, not just as a main verb, not just like I am talking, not just as I am a woman, but I am talking is a support verb. It goes with other verbs to tell you when you did it. I was talking, I am talking, I will be talking. And there's a lot of variation in the verb to be. And I started to look at this. Shropshire speakers across time have had various forms competing. So what we tend to associate the north with is forms like he were a grand old man were our dad, he were, and we imagine that the south is all full of people saying we was, you was, they was. So we was, they was, you was is south, but it's not nearly that simple. And in fact, we can see that there are lots of forms in competition with each other. So we get things like, you know where the barn houses is. I think most standard speakers will be happy with are because houses is plural. And I did look at some of the data from Ironbridge, the museum at Ironbridge, when they interviewed the workers who were still there. They've got lots and lots of transcripts. And in fact, many of the miners, many of the foundry workers, their dialect is what we would say mixed. You know, they're aware of the standard, but they do still do different stuff. So they'll say things like, some of the places we went into the rock was this is a dubious example. Some of the places we went into the rock that's okay, that's standard. You know where the barn houses is. Before the March offensive, we was never out of the line. Okay, we was never out of the line for weeks and weeks before the Germans come over in March. But then you get things, so you get we was, but you also get the first part, they were very short of Royal Artillery. That's the same speaker. After we left China, we got down to South Africa and I were detached from the regiment. So this is one speaker and you can see the variation. So we got they were, but I were, which is, we would mark that as non-standard, and also we was. So there are both things going on in one speaker, and that's the reality of linguistics. You can draw lines on maps, but actually what speakers do may vary from moment to moment, and it depends on who they're talking to. So don't forget, they were being interviewed here by friends of Ironbridge, who they may or may not have known. So some of them were volunteers who'd lived in the area, some weren't, and that will affect what they say. But it's really interesting to look at that data. And they do still now, they have different forms of the present tense. So we've got different forms of the verb to be. So again, from Ironbridge, one of the first questions they'd ask the beast in the union, and you get bist as well, bist in the union, beast in the union, bisty. You do get all these different forms of the verb to be, and it would be really interesting to see to what extent they A, survive, and B, are they still being used? Are young people still using them? A little bit more about foot and strut, though not too much. So we said that strut was coming into Shropshire, things like strut and cut and blood, and we'll listen now. This is a school teacher, so she's from Brockton, which is not far from Allstretton. She was born in 1921, but she sounds fairly posh, I think. We'll see what you think. I won't play you much.
When do you think the beginning of the farming technology revolution began?
Well, when I went to college in 1939-40, we'd still got horses. I don't say Dad wasn't the most forward-looking of, farmers. And then within 2 or 3 years, we'd got tractors and combines. So then I should think it began to happen during the war, must have done. But the whole thing changed. But Dad never became very up-to-date, really, I don't think. Because I remember...
So you can hear that there are 3 that we had must have done, up-to-date. She doesn't have up and must and done. She's got some sort of difference, and yet you'll say she's a school teacher. She went away and trained. We don't know what she did as a young woman. She still has a rhotic accent. She still says 30, so she has Shropshire features, but she definitely has this vowel. And she's, whatever we think about this, she's back living in the area she was born in. She's part of the speech community, and she's brought this change with her. Then we can see how these kinds of changes spread. This is an older speaker from near Bridgenorth, who was born in the 1880s, and he still doesn't have a split. So I'll just play you him quickly. Hopefully we can hear that.
You remember him stopping the farmers and sending the fowl up, unless you had a lad. See, you lead the first. You see, a place like Wolverhampton and all them big towns, you could drive hour in length, one in front of each other, nobody with you. See? Then then it'd come as they stopped us. We was to have 3. And put the 2 first doubles, we got them more under control, if you can understand, because you could put a line, get a geo line, fasten it onto that arse of that side and one of this side, see? Well, you could have it in your hand and lead, you shafty. Well, you see, when you got 4 in length, you couldn't have a line on every one. And then, of course, these motors bruised up, and they had to come down to 2 then a piece. 2 is much.
So instead of up, we've got up. Well, we might want to argue that he is listening again. Does he have a split there? I'm not sure what you think, whether he's got 2 sets of words, but there's certainly more northern in quality, which you might expect from the map that I showed you, because he's further east and he's slightly further north. The problem is that we draw all these lines on maps, and Alexander Ellis actually did a really good job, because he did realise that we're in a transition zone. This split is sort of happening now in real time, and the test for us is this split going to go complete? Are we going to get speakers, for example, in Newcastle upon Tyne saying strut and but and up? Is that ever going to happen? Can that happen now, or are we stuck with half the country doing one thing, doing this strut, and maybe the Midlands with something in between, and the North with no split? We don't know how this is going to pan out, but sources like Ellis are really useful to us, because they did pay a lot of attention to these different dialect forms between the 2 vowels. They even spoke to people about it and said, do you say cut? Do you say cut? Is it something in between? What do you think you say? What did your friends say? They paid incredible attention to this, and it's just wonderful data. We'll listen to some young people now. We're almost ready for questions, but I want to just play some people from the young farmers in Clun. I say Clun, Clun, Clun. And it's interesting because they have got a mixture. They've got a real mixture. So just listen. One speaker actually changes from to in one conversation. I'll just play you a little bit. You also have to excuse them swearing.
To be in Young Farmers, what does it take, Emma?
You don't necessarily have to be from a farming background, because a lot of our new members aren't, but I think you just have to be willing to make new friends, really.
And is it a good place to make new friends?
Very good place to make new friends.
I get a sense, moving on from Emma, this is Kate Matthews next. I get a sense, Kate, that people in Young Farmers have a lot of fun.
Yeah, we do have a lot of fun.
For example, something last Friday, tell us about that.
Oh, last Friday we did our entertainment, which was entitled A Daydream, which all of us 30 clan members, which we wrote and produced ourselves, and we performed that for friends and family of the club. Then we had a cheese and wine evening after. So, okay. And we had also another club from Pennybont joined us, and they did their entertainment. Okay,
so that's Kate Matthews. Before that we had Emma, and this is the first of three brothers who are taking part in the group. This is Nathan Davis, spelt the Welsh way, Davies. Nathan, you've just graduated in agriculture.
Yeah.
In what college, or from what college?
Walford and North Shropshire College.
How many years were you there?
2, yeah.
What was it like, those 2 years?
Well, it was all right, a bit of a DOS. But
college years are always meant to be a DOS.
That's right, that's right. Anyway. You've got to enjoy it when you're young, innit?
Yeah. But has it confirmed you in your calling to work on the land, so to speak?
No.
Why is that?
Well,
or are you just joking?
Well, joking and serious, really. There isn't going to be much of a future in farming the way Tony Blair's running this country.
Right. Now we're right into politics before we go any further. You're not his number one fan?
No.
Okay. You reckon agriculture is going down the chute?
Well, if the government have their way, it will, yeah.
You've got strong opinions on that. We may come back to them subsequently, but in the meantime, moving along, that's Nathan Davis. This is Wayne Davis, your older brother. Are you the oldest in the family?
I am, yes. I'm the oldest.
And tell us briefly a potted history of your involvement with Young Farmers in Clun.
Well, I think I joined Clun as well.
That's enough. You can hear, I think, that, sometimes they say Clun, running, and sometimes they have vowels that are much more northern and they just seem to turn up fairly randomly. We need to investigate whether something's controlling that, whether it's the shape of the word, whether it's a place name like Clun. Is that more likely to become Clun? So place names often behave quite differently. There's lots of work to do there. And I'm not going to go through this because I'm running over time and I could show you this, but actually there's an awful lot going on with Bath. So we get things like in Kinnersley, we get from the Survey of English Dialects in the 50s, we just get speakers who say bath and trap, and they also say start. So they start. So they have a r in the start set, but it's an a sound. And that's very much what we find across Shropshire in the Survey of English Dialects. What we are also finding, though, is that it's the start sets that start becoming more received pronunciation, like soonest. If we lose r, and we do start to lose r quite early on. So if instead of saying start or start, we say start, then we have to lengthen anyway. We've got to lengthen because we've got to fill up where we lost the r. And what then happened was that it seems to become trend in 18th century London to just go backwards. And instead of saying start or start, to say start, to make the sound that the dentist makes you do when you open your mouth, which is the furthest back we can go and the lowest that we can go. And this change is still happening, and it does seem to start with these start sets. So I would play you that, but we're short of time, and I wanted to talk about words as well before we finish. So words in Shropshire, lexis in Shropshire, we do know that there's an awful lot of work being done on collecting the words of Shropshire. And the main person who worked on this was Georgina Jackson. She ended up being used as a source by Joseph Wright for his English Dialect Dictionary, and she indeed, there's a big dedication to him. at the front of her dialect dictionary, but it was painstaking. It's an absolutely towering achievement. So she was local, studied linguistics herself, and it's a 520-page work. I'm sure lots of you know it. And there are other brilliant books. So Valerie Kitson wrote a book in the 80s, Shropshire Words, and it's brilliant. So it does have things like jockey for a lad. Jockey's still in use. You can still hear jockey used and said, and it is sort of related to the idea of Jack just meaning a man, like every man Jack, or Jack in the box, or Jack the lad. Jack is just a common boy's name, and it comes to stand for all men. The fact that it's jockey, this O, marks it as West Midlands. So you get things like hand, but in Shropshire you'd get ond. Hand, you drop the H. Shropshire's an H dropping dialect. You drop H's, and you'd get ond and lond for land. Nesh turns up in Kitford's book in 1992. So Nesh is somebody who feels the cold. These are Old English words. This is just from Old English nesh, which means soft. Okay, someone who's soft. A shippen, again, this is Old English, but it's a typically West Midlands word for a cowshed. That's still known. And blarting, I don't know whether people still know blarting, but this is just Mercian Old English for bleotan, which is both what children and cattle do. They bleat. Okay, so we've got these Old English words. There's continued interest in dialect lexicon. So there's just been this lovely book published this year by Fairacre Press, which is called Fanpeckled. And I don't know if anybody knows what fanpeckled means, but freckled. So freckled, if somebody's fanpeckled, they're freckled. And they've actually drawn on Georgina Jackson, and they've together written poetry and illustrated it, inspired by Shropshire dialect. So there's a very, very continued interest in this. And one last mention of something that needs looking at, actually, that is the relationship between the two languages of Shropshire, because we can find sources. So Ravenstein was looking at migration into Shropshire, out of Shropshire. And in 1878, he's reporting that there are parishes. So Sichtin is overwhelmingly Welsh speaking. The western half of Llanybladwell, Salatin, still Welsh speakers. And the 1901 census for neighbouring Denbighshire. So the great majority of those born in the Shropshire parishes and in Oswestry itself are listed as Welsh speakers. So there was a long history of Shropshire having Welsh speakers in it who were born in Shropshire. Welsh was a language of Shropshire, as it was for the whole of England, right? Welsh is not confined to Wales historically. Welsh was the language we were all speaking before the Anglo-Saxon invasions. And you get other bloggers reporting this, and these need to be followed up, but there's no reason to disprove what they're saying, to sort of doubt what they're saying. There are still headmistresses post-war saying that there are Welsh speakers born in Shropshire in Salatin Village School. There are Welsh colliers working in Ifton Mine in 1968 who live in Shropshire. And we could go on about that, but it makes a difference, because if one set of your community is speaking a different language, then they're going to acquire English in a different way, possibly. Possibly if they acquire it as a second language, it might have a slightly different flavour if they acquire it at school. And that's something to think about for the future. And I'll leave you with a final thought. So in 1963, Dawley Newtown was designated. Now, previous research by Judy Dyer, who was from Corby, and Sue Fox and Paul Kurzweil in Milton Keynes suggests that new towns create a coignée situation for dialects. That is, speakers from different areas converge on the linguistically most prolific variable. So if you've got something like some of you saying strut and some of you saying strut, it's going to be the weight of numbers that might tip it towards you all saying strut in that area. So I can see in the questions, people have asked about Black Country people coming into Dawley Newtown, what became Telford. This is of interest and this needs researching. And I know people are working on Telford and doing Telford Our Town, this wonderful project. It needs looking at, because Telford's accent and dialect are distinct to some extent from the rest of Shropshire. And this is down to migration, possibly. So we need to see what exactly happens when large numbers of people, not historically from an area, come into it. And I'll leave it there, throw it open to questions. Thank you for your patience. Any errors are entirely mine. As I said, I'm not at all an expert in this, but please do ask all your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. That was so interesting. And we've had lots of comments. So I think you've picked up on the question from Pete Jackson, who says that he's interested in the links between the east of the county, for example, Dawley and the Black Country, following the events in the coal and iron industry in 1821, classified as Cinderloo. The events led to migration to Black Country according to the family research we've done. Could the East Shropshire dialect have influenced Black Country in that period? I think you've sort of answered that.
That's kind of going the other way around there. You're saying, does the Shropshire dialect influence Black Country dialects? Let me just get this straight. I think I want to be, yeah, so Dawley and the Black Country. Yeah, Cinderloo. Yeah, because of course, if you go to the Black Country, you've got a Salop Street in nearly every town in the Black Country. There's a Salop Street in Bilston, there's a Salop Street in Dudley, there's a Salop Street, there's one in Birmingham. It's likely that some of the features we share anyway, I mean, how are we going to track something like shouldna and couldna and hannah and wunna? I think at that time, they were also happening in the Black Country, right? So the Black Country now, we think everybody says A and day and bay and core, but in fact, old Black Country speakers, they also used couldna, wouldna, didna, hadna, just like Shropshire. And what seems to be new in the Black Country is these newer forms. So the answer is we don't know, and it's going to be really hard to find out, but I'm looking forward to trying, right?
Okay, thank you. And then lots of comments. Heather, she's from Melverley, husband from Welshhampton, and yes, we absolutely pronounce blood and cut differently in accordance with that line that you looked at on the map. So that's interesting.
That is, it is. So there is a split. You've got a split, basically.
Yeah. Fiona spotted Oud for old.
Ode, yeah, ode or ode. Yeah, and this is L vocalization when you turn your lut into a w. And this again is, I mean, this happens in, how far does this happen? Where does this stop happening, right? Are they still doing it in Herefordshire? Are they doing it in South Shropshire? We don't know, but it's a typical Shropshire feature, and you can see that it is because it's what we call in registered. People who write it down, they actually want to show you that they say ode and they write the W. So it's something people notice in Shropshire as well, and that makes a difference. When people notice it, they might go to good lengths to avoid it if they're trying to sound posh, or they might say, I'm going to Shropshire it up. I really want to make it clear that I'm from Shropshire, so I shall do this.
Yes.
So it's one to watch, isn't it, basically?
Yeah. And Jenny says, this is lovely. My auntie used to say, her was meant to be letterbox. Her was about someone with a big mouth.
I love it.
Yeah.
So, but you've got, and we know that's, I mean, I hope people are still using it. And do people see it as Shropshire? You know, did you realise that it was typically Shropshire? Because it's a typically Western Midlands thing. This use of her, and it goes right down to Herefordshire, and it even goes, you see it in people who've learned English as a second language across the border in Wales. You know, they're still using her. So,
yes, yeah. And I think it's Helen. Has Esther heard of the term Upper Wummer? I must admit I have heard this from a friend who teaches in Minsterley. It's a dialect spoken by people from the Pontesbury, Minsterley, Stiperstones area. And she works with two lovely ladies who speak Upper Wummer, Upper Hill Dweller, and Cunna, Wunna, Shunna, Bist are very much alive and well.
Yeah. And this is fascinating because these are so different, right, from standard English, and yet they're still, dialect persists in the face of everything that schools do to, arguably, I mean, they teach us to write English down, and once you write it down, you're not taught to write bist and dunna, and you will get your book corrected, even if you're allowed to speak it in the playground, even if you have a teacher who says, yeah, we can look at this is interesting. There's big pressure on you to abandon it, but it's still there, and thank you, Helen, that's really, really interesting. And I hadn't heard Upper Woman, that's lovely.
Yes, yeah. And then I wasn't sure how to pronounce, I think you did say the name of this place, didn't you?
I said Sichtin, but I might be wrong. I mean, I'm just pronouncing it as a Welsh person would pronounce it, but then there are pronunciations in Shropshire for Welsh place names that are not the same as a native Welsh speaker would pronounce it. So Sichtin, Sichtin like Southern, but like Sichtin. Okay. Yeah.
That one. Tom Thorpe, he was at school in the 1980s at both Welsh School and Bishop's Castle. The accents between the two areas were distinct. The accent in the former was much slower than the latter.
Yeah.
Do differences remain?
Wouldn't it be lovely to find out? I mean, we can certainly look at the sound clips now, and I hope that having introduced you to these, you will go and do what I've done and listen. And in as much as English is spoken in Welshpool, so it was slower in Welshpool than it was in Bishop's Castle. And I would imagine they were distinct and probably are still distinct in many ways. And is Welshpool becoming more Welsh English? Has it lost any connections that it had to Shropshire dialect because it's so close to the border and because you would have traded, you know, across those borders. We just don't know. And that's a really interesting one anyway. Slowness, we know that rate of speech is a factor, but it's phenomenally hard to measure. You have to control for things like different speakers. I speak fast, for example. I'm a fast speaker. So how do we get a community of people from Bishop's Castle and regulate them for speed? You get them to read a passage and then you count how long it takes, right? But it's really hard to do. But it would be lovely, and it's really, really great that you noticed that. Thank you.
And then Fiona said that in the mid-60s, Dawley still had a unique accent. These villages were quite self-contained, and she knew an ode man. Did you say ode?
Yeah, ode man or ode mon?
Yeah, from Wellington, which and the accent was very distinctive as well.
Yeah, which goes back to what I was saying about I mean, they were right in the Survey of English Dialects. They were right that there were people who, you know, they grew up in that village, they married someone from that village, they stayed there, they never left. And you could tell from village to village. And can we still do that? Is our ability to do that breaking down? Does it depend on how old the person is, how much they preserved their dialect? But absolutely. And Dawley was pretty self-contained. They would have been. You know, nobody had cars. That wasn't anything that a working person would have afforded or had. And if you did have it, you couldn't take it to Clun because you'd get snowed in, like the old man said. So, yeah. And yeah, so yeah, the difference between the north and the south of the county is, I think, still quite marked, right? That's something that could be investigated.
And then we've just got time for a couple of questions from the chat. Gerdus, when I mention dialect, people tend not to understand, conflate dialect with accent. Is this because there is so much emphasis on standard English at the expense of regional language?
Oh, I think, you know, as well, if you ask people who aren't linguists, they will say things like, they think that punctuation is part of dialect. They would think written English is part of dialect. And is it, isn't it? It's really hard, isn't it? And we're trained to sort of keep dialect and accents. Accent is part of dialect for me, right? Accent is part of your dialect. It would be highly unlikely that you would speak Shropshire English with a Liverpool accent, for example, or that I would speak it with a Scottish accent. Not impossible, but really, really odd. What might be more normal is that I would have a Shropshire accent, but speak standard English, right? So standard English is a strange dialect. It's kind of divorced itself from any accents. Most of us speak some form of standard English at some time, and we certainly write it. But we put our own accent onto it, right? So I've got certain words that I know are Midlands, but I still use them around people I know understand them. I'll use K-Life for sure, but I'll use mon instead of man sometimes for a joke. But mostly I've got a sort of, I don't know, nearly RP Midlandsy accent on standard English, right? So there is overlap. And for us, we always, as linguists, we talk about dialect as meaning accent, the words that you use, the shape of the words, we call that morphology, and syntax, the structure of the sentence, right? So we've got 4 parts to it, and accent is one part of it. But you're right that they conflate it. And I just don't know whether it's making it worse that we sort of emphasize standard English. Do we emphasize standard English, or do we emphasize different accents? That's something to think about, isn't it? What do employers ask you for? Are they bothered if you say Dunner and Shannon and Connor? I think it depends where you work, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And then the last question from Tom Thorpe. Welsh was spoken very rarely in Welshpool. Did the Welsh Language Act make a difference?
Yes, it's making a difference. I'm not an expert on revitalising languages, but certainly the active suppression of Welsh led people to think that they should, and they did learn English for commerce purposes, right? So if you're told repeatedly, you know, and there were schools teaching in Welsh, and there were schools teaching everything in Welsh, and they knew that their pupils would only learn through the medium of Welsh, and they weren't about to say to a group of 5-year-olds, I'm going to speak English to you, even though you don't understand. If you had sympathetic teachers, they would explain in Welsh and they would help you. But it was very much viewed as the poor cousin, and you should learn English. And I'm sure that did affect, you know, we know that it's, even in Mid Wales, it's losing numbers, right? As the older speakers die, it's not regaining those numbers. It's making a difference. I think it's making a difference to people's attitudes. People want to learn it now. It's cool to learn it in some circles. But much of this damage is really got to be, you know, they've had to take severe action to undo this, I think. One of the links I put into my talk was about Oswestry College hoping to offer Welsh GCSE. And actually quite a lot of people on the Shropshire side of the border have said, well, we know we do still intermarry. We go over to take jobs there, you know, farmers regularly commute between the two. It would be useful for us. So please, could we have that? And that, I thought that was a little bit of a ray of hope, actually.
Yes, brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much, Esther. That was fascinating and lots of brilliant comments from the audience.
Thank you all for your input. That's kind of...
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And we look forward to seeing Esther again soon, hopefully, for another lecture. I think there's definitely lots more to come there. And Heather just says, really interesting, thank you. Yes, tidy, says Tom. So on that note, we will end, and thank you to Hope from the University Events team who's helped in the background here. That's brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.